Hi, I'm Kieren.
And I'm Riku.
And welcome to Artificially Ever After for a very special episode.
A live event on hidden AI.
Yeah, so welcome back.
Welcome back. We've been away for 1 month longer than we hoped.
We did. We skipped a month last month, mainly to prepare for what has been a very exciting episode this time around.
Yeah, we had to dedicate a bit more time to prepare because we actually did a live recording.
Yeah, there was a company in Bristol where Riku and I do our research and where we live that approached us, and they do this interactive week-long event every year, which basically aims to demystify data science and just big data for the general public, and they wanted us to come and do an event as part of that focused on AI. That was what we did a couple of weeks ago now, wasn't it?
Yeah, and when they first came to us, I don't think we realised that it would be in like the Bristol City Hall. So it's like one of the biggest main buildings in Bristol. Yeah,
it was a very, very big venue. There's a few hundred people there, and we were pitched the idea of a live interactive podcast, which we kind of jumped at the opportunity without realising what that would actually entail. But the way it kind of works was we did our normal first half, second half of the podcast, but in between we mixed in some audience questions.
The topic of the podcast was on hidden AI. And I mean, this is our first double-digit episode, number 10.
Yeah.
And in this episode, we kind of covered a lot of the core themes that we may have already introduced.
Yeah, so we do repeat ourselves on a couple of instances. We talk about some new stuff, though, so we focus a lot in the second half on generative AI. Yeah, we hope you enjoy.
So our next session is Hidden AI, How Algorithms Influence Our Daily Lives.
Yeah, hi everyone. Thank you. I'm Kieren.
And I'm Riku.
And yeah, welcome to our podcast, Artificially Ever After. It's very strange doing this in front of a crowd of people. Riku and I normally just sat in this tiny little box room up in university where we record this podcast. But yeah, thank you Hugh and JGI for having us. We just wanted to kick off by just introducing Riku and I, a really quick background on us and how we came to start this podcast. So Riku and I are longtime friends. We did our undergrad degrees here at Bristol together and then went on to do masters. And then we're both now doing PhD research in AI. So, and with this podcast as well, we can't seem to escape each other.
And living together.
And we live together, yeah. So yeah, we see each other very often. But yeah, after starting our research, we basically both felt that there was this significant gap opening up between the latest research and development going on in AI and public awareness and understanding, especially at the rate at which AI was being integrated into society. So motivated by that, we started this podcast where, as Hugh was saying, so each time we take a different topic or application of AI. I think our last episode was an AI a day keeps the doctor away, so looking at AI in healthcare. And we try and demystify that technology and look forward to possible future directions. Think about the ethical and societal concerns. So yeah, we've spent a lot of time recently thinking about the future of AI, which is why we wanted to come here today. But we're going to be focusing on hidden AI because that aligns quite well with our motivation of that podcast. So do you want to give us a bit of a structure on what we're going to be discussing there?
Yeah, so this podcast episode will be on two halves. So in the first half, we'll talk about what is hidden AI, recommendation systems, and then we're going to have a little bit of time for listener questions. And then we'll have a little fun fact segment, which is kind of part of our podcast gimmick, just to have a little bit of a breather. And then in the second half, talk about generative AI, a bit about the future, and then have some more time for listener questions.
Yeah. So to kick us off then, I'm going to do what I normally do in the podcast because we don't have an audience sitting in front of us, and I play the role of the listeners. So I'm going to ask Riku if you want to define what is hidden AI.
So hidden AI talks about the AIs that are integrated into our everyday systems. And specifically, these AIs are ones that you use that it's not necessarily clear that you're actually interacting with AI. And previously in these systems, maybe a human was making some decisions for you, or the human was acting as the online agent. But now the AI is replacing those, and it's not clear that you're actually interacting with an AI. So a really widespread usage of hidden AI is in recommendation systems that we see in social media. But in other use cases like credit assignment, if you're going to get a loan, now an AI often makes that decision for you. Another one that's pretty serious, especially in the US, is like payroll assessment in the justice system. So these big decisions that affect your lives are now a lot of the time being decided by an AI when you're not even aware of it.
Yeah, and I guess that the inverse of that is visible AI shock. And some examples there, so you've got like chatbots, so ChatGPT, Siri, Alexa, self-driving cars as well. So these are examples where when we're using that technology, we very explicitly know that we're getting AI, and that's the kind of inverse there, isn't it? So, but yeah, do you want to like generally define the task of recommendation, and we'll step back a bit?
Yeah, so today we'll talk, hidden AI is a big field, but we'll talk about recommendation systems today, just because it's the most widespread hidden AI that we interact with. And we think about recommendation systems as like an AI concept, but we're actually going to take a step back and think about what recommendation systems were before AI. And the task recommendation is when there are too many options and you just need someone or something to tell you what to pick. And a lot of the time that's meant to be for your best interest. So we're going to play a bit of a game here with a lovely Hugh here. And because I've heard you have explored a lot of the Bristol cafes. So
bit of a pastry connoisseur, one might say.
Yeah, exactly. So maybe if someone was to ask you, which cafe would you recommend? What kind of things would you consider before giving that recommendation?
Right, so I remember when you guys kind of briefed me and asked me about this before. So thinking like Riku, I mean, you don't need to be sat near the front to see Riku's like quite athletic and he likes to look out how much he eats and stuff like that. So we're looking for something like maybe a bit more low calorie, if he has any like dietary requirements, and then like he's on a PhD stipend, so he's probably not going to go somewhere too expensive.
Might overindulge then?
Well, a little birdie told me that you like cinnamon twirls, so we'd probably look for somewhere like, again, also thinking about somewhere that's local to you both, not recommending you like go to London for a pastry sort of thing. Yeah, so those kind of things I would think off the top of my head.
And also, do you consider maybe, how happy we are with your recommendation?
Right, that's really important to me because, like, I guess it would mean, why would you ask, if I gave you a rubbish recommendation, why would you come back to me again? Well, not that I'm, like, making business from recommending pastries to people, but,
Yeah, and I'd hope as a friend you would,
sure.
you would want...
I'm incentivized, right, yeah.
So this here is an example of what recommendation systems are and how they actually serve society. Part of the equation is actually the satisfaction of the person who wants the recommendation. And a really intuitive example, which, a bit of a bigger scale, there is like 100 cafes in Bristol, but if you think about a library, there's probably thousands of books, and you want to find a book for you. It's not realistic for you to look at all the blurbs and pick one yourself. And this is actually the first instance of like an AI kind of recommendation system was implemented, called the Grundy system in 1979. So these aren't actually that new. And the key thing there is that an expert librarian has thought of these if-then rules to profile you, to find a book that you'll be satisfied with. So again, the original systems did consider the satisfaction of the people looking for a book.
Yeah, and I think since then, over the past several decades now, obviously, as we've generated more data, there's more information online that we need to interact with, that task of recommendation has got even more important. It's not feasible to look through all of that information to find what we want. So Riku and I actually set ourselves a task to go away and think if we could list all the different areas when we interact with the digital world where we interact with the recommendation system. And for me, the list was definitely longer than I was expecting, but I'm going to put Hugh back on the spot here again now and see if you can think of any recommendation systems you interact with.
Sure, so I guess like search engines, right, is the obvious one. And then I'm just thinking like every week Spotify is like, here's songs we think you might like. And some weeks they give me a list of songs that I hate, and sometimes they give me my new favorite song. So those would be like the two examples that jump out at me for sure.
Yeah, I think entertainment as well is another big one. So you think of
Netflix.
Netflix. Stat on Netflix actually, so over 80% of Netflix content is consumed through recommendation systems, and a similar one for YouTube videos as well. So over 70% of YouTube videos are being recommended to people rather than explicitly searched for. Another one too is Google Maps. So that's a really interesting one because, so firstly, if we're thinking about coffee shops, you might not know which coffee shop you want to go to. You might want to go to a coffee shop in a certain area. So firstly, you're getting recommended which coffee shop to go to. Then you might not know how to get there, so it could recommend a route. So that's a really interesting one because, we're not just being told how to navigate the digital world there, but it's actually influencing how we navigate through the physical world as well. So yeah, I think it's very hard, and this is again why we're talking about recommendation systems now, because it's hard to go anywhere, both digitally and online, where we don't come into contact with some recommendation algorithm. And what we've seen back from when we had the Grundy system and to what we have today is this change in this kind of central goal of that algorithm. So historically there, with searching for a book in the library, the central goal there was very much to recommend you like the best content for what you were searching for and to try and satisfy you with that specific need. Now, because we've got so many different recommendation algorithms working in conjunction on the digital world, the goal is changed to trying to maximize your engagement and kind of fight for your time on that specific website using that specific algorithm, hasn't it?
Yeah, and the key difference here is that when you maximize for engagement, all that matters is that whether you click on the content that's recommended to you. So what we had previously with the Grundy system of Hugh here, like the satisfaction is not part of the equation anymore. And another thing is that Hugh is the expert in the bakeries, and and with the Grundy system you have an expert librarian doing recommendations. So they kind of know what a good book is. But now the expert in the AI is actually looking at your micro behaviors. The way they profile you is actually on not necessarily your things that make you an individual, but actually how long do you spend on each post when you scroll, maybe your reactions to it. So you get some crazy stories where some recommendation systems actually can predict if you're expecting a baby, and sometimes it's before the person even knows it themselves. Yeah. So this is the kind of level of profiling that these hidden AIs can do.
And to emphasize that point that they're maximizing engagement and the more time you kind of interact with them, the better they get. I think a really good example, which we'd probably all think of, is TikTok. So I've just got some worldwide usage stats for TikTok as of July 2023, so nearly a year ago now. But they had 1 billion active monthly users. And over 90% of those users were using the app daily. And over 60% of them spent over 10 hours per week on the app. And if you extrapolate that out to the average lifetime, which maybe is a bit of an assumption, but that equates to nearly 2.3 years of the average life spent on TikTok, which is just mind-blowing. And what's also concerning as well is that we see these very clear trends that TikTok usage and time spent on the app is just going up and up, whilst other social medias are going down. So people are spending more of their time on TikTok, and it's getting more of this data. It's kind of hooking people in more, so you can clearly see the effects of that goal being maximized.
And just for context, the NHS kind of recommend about 2.5 hours of exercise per week. But with some surveys, we found that 25% of UK population don't do 1 half-an-hour workout a week. And a stat from the US is that the average reading time per week is less than 2 hours. So we're looking at 5 times as much time spent on apps like TikTok than these maybe more productive ways of using our time. So the big question is, do these systems serve us or persuade us?
Yeah, like what, are they actually maximizing what we want, what is best for us? I'd argue that, if you're spending 5 times more time on TikTok, it's definitely not. And another stat as well, I'm sure you believe us at this point, but there was a really interesting study that was published, 4 papers actually published last year in Science and Nature journals. And they did this huge study on nearly 300 million Facebook users and Instagram users during the 2020 US election cycle. And what they found was they were looking at basically does switching from a chronological feed where you're just shown information in the order in which it was posted versus switching to a recommendation algorithm. They wanted to see the effects of those two groups. And there were loads of things that were found, but one of the main things they identified was that when you switch to a recommendation system, people spend over 50% more time on that app when you switch to that, which is just crazy, isn't it?
Wow, so taking a bit of a bigger picture and look at the expectations and reality. So we have to kind of think about why these systems were built. And they actually were built for more connectivity, but we see a lot less time we spent together physically. Maybe information sharing, the idea was to democratize being able to publish your opinions. Before social media, you'd have to rely on the big media companies, but now everyone has a voice. But in reality, we see a lot of fake news and content addiction. Community building was another intention, that you have access to all the communities in the world, and maybe you can have a bigger worldview. But in reality, we see a lot of polarization and echo chambers, which again, in AI, the goal wasn't to have these negative consequences. And what happens in AI is you always specify the goal, but you can't specify the means. And this is how machine learning works in general. So it's not necessarily that these were designed to be bad. But the key lesson I think we learned from social media when we look back is about responsibility. And the companies didn't take the responsibility required to make sure that the goal was met with the right means. And this fell on the individual, and it's equated to these outcomes.
Yeah, it's a really good quote that we got from the people that made The Social Dilemma, which was a really good Netflix documentary all on recommendation systems. And they were saying that when you discover a new technology and start implementing that, you also uncover a whole new set of responsibilities. So the reason we're talking about recommendation systems to start with today is because we've just discovered and uncovered this new technology of generative AI, and we're kind of enrolling it out into society, and we really need to think long and hard about the responsibilities that come with implementing that new technology. So that's what we're going to come on to in this second half. So we've looked back now, and we're going to be looking forward after a quick round of questions. So.
Yeah, it's super interesting because some of the panels from this morning, we were talking about how generative AI is coming into our lives, and how there feels like there should be a responsibility on industries to regulate and think more carefully about how they're doing and how they're rolling out these new technologies, but oftentimes they're just not taking that responsibility because they're just not incentivized to.
And it's falling on us as individuals.
Right, so. Exactly, yeah. Okay, so now we're going to go into the Q&A section. So I'm going to start with a question that was submitted through like the ticket tailor and the sign-up, which I think will be nice to get the ball rolling, and then we'll have some opportunity for people in the audience to ask questions on the microphones. So someone asked, how can I optimize the way algorithms influence me in a positive way? Thoughts?
Recommendation question. It's a very good question. I think it's also because, as we were kind of mentioning, we can't really get away from these algorithms now, so you do obviously want to maximize how you're engaging with them positively. But in order to do that, you need to know you're interacting with an algorithm in the first place. And I think from when we went away to think of all the different ones we interacted with, there's way more than you actually expect. So I'd say firstly, just kind of sit down and have a think, like what websites you go to, what apps you use, and then is that content that you're consuming, have you explicitly searched for that, or is it being recommended to you? And if the answer is the latter, you want to think like, do your historical interactions with that website and the data that they therefore have on you, does that represent you as an individual, and do you want to be recommended more content that aligns with that? And I guess if the answer is no, you could like delete all your cookies and like delete your history from that site, try and hit refresh, and then moving forward, just interact with that algorithm much more mindfully. And when you're making decisions, clicking on things, be a lot more mindful with what information you're giving them. And I guess one really good thing you could do is to actually leave feedback. So rather than let these algorithms just infer your behavior and your preferences, you can leave feedback, leave ratings to show it what you do like and dislike. There's also a lot of these apps now have the little 3 dots next to a post or a bit of information, which they sometimes give you the optionality to say, show me less of this content, or this isn't relevant to me. So yeah, strongly recommend like actually guiding that algorithm in the direction that you want it to go, rather than just letting it guess that for you.
Yeah, these are good like practical tips, and I think more just a perspective idea would be to treat our online content a bit like how we treat our diets, like what stuff we consume online. So for me, I'd say that those addictive funny cat videos, to me, I should look at them like chocolate. And we've heard about having a balanced diet, and maybe your vegetables can be like a documentary, and your carbs can be something that excites you. But I think a lot of the time when you just recommended things, it's just going to skew you to just always buy chocolate. So I think having that mindset of actually taking responsibility, sadly the company should have taken that, but as an individual, you do have the power to affect what content you will consume online.
Ironically, I was thinking of the recommenders that would probably recommend me actual chocolate. Yeah. Is there anyone feeling brave from the audience who would like to ask questions?
You were talking about book search, and I was just thinking that, when you go to a bookshop and you're after something, but actually so much of the process of rummaging through is where you come across something that actually is really significant to you, or that you weren't quite looking for. How do we balance that equilibrium between this efficiency? The efficiency is great, but then also this kind of like the process, the journey, the voyage of there's potentially something very lost in that as well.
Yeah, so it's almost like what are we losing from the process of searching, I guess?
It's a really interesting question, a good point. I know I actually get a lot of stick from my parents because, when I was doing my degree and stuff, they'd always say, you can just Google it now, like you don't have to actually go and search through the whole library to find that textbook and then find the relevant information in the textbook. So we are definitely losing something. But I think, as we were discussing, it's just with the sheer amount of information that's out there now, in the digital world especially, there are certain aspects there that we could never feasibly search now. So there are definitely areas where we need those algorithms. Granted, if that's spilling out into the physical world, it's definitely losing something. But I think, There's also a gain there. I'd say that there's definitely a productivity gain that comes with being able to find something very efficiently and quickly on Google. So, it's pros and cons, isn't it, with anything at AI there, but very interesting point.
I think one perspective is that it's not necessarily an AI problem, but it's a human values problem. So we need to identify which of these journeys do we actually find value in. So if you go into a book with a recommendation system, maybe if the journey isn't valuable, you just want to find a book. But in this case, I'd agree with you that when I look for a book, I love to read through all the blurbs and actually figures out which book is the best. But maybe in some other situations, when you're looking for an article, if you don't use a recommendation system, you'd have to firstly sort all the websites by A to Z or when they'll publish and look through them all. And maybe in that case, there is no value in the journey. And I think that is a human value issue. We need to figure out which journeys we actually want to practice.
And it's also now becoming like a bit of a skill to search. I mean, I remember when I started my PhD and like my supervisor was like, go find a paper on this. So I just Googled it. And then the first 100 results were not useful. And I was like, oh, maybe I should go on like Google Scholar. And then maybe I should like filter by how many citations a publication has or something like that. So people were talking about in previous sessions about like prompt engineering. If people are using like ChatGPT to search for stuff now, you've got to kind of ask in a particular way, and in the same way that when you use Google, you can specify like, okay, I need this word I'm mentioning in my Google search, has to be relevant in the search that you're doing. You can like do that. So so I guess in some ways that's putting some onus back on us and giving us like some power and ownership over it, for sure.
It's a great question, thank you.
Any other questions?
Hello, thank you very much for this discussion. I want to ask something that is what I've been hearing the most of, as in daily AI influence. This thing about posts with political content on Facebook, especially being pushed and boosted when they feel more controversial, and also about being fed posts that are closer to the views we seem to have. And I think this is very dangerous at a level I cannot even fathom. But is there any way we could influence the algorithm in that area?
Really good question. One first thing that I'd note, which at the risk of sounding somewhat controversial here, that study that I was mentioning, those few studies that were published last year, they were looking at kind of political information being shown on people's feeds. And one really interesting thing that kept coming up there is that even though on people's Facebook and Instagram feeds, reshares, so when you're not actually posting new information, you're just resharing it, made up a very small fraction of the total amount of content that people were consuming, yet it actually contained the most polarizing and politically controversial and often untrue information was all in those reshares. So I think this is going to a point that Riku and I often make, and this is what I was saying about sound a bit controversial, that these algorithms are kind of playing into human behavior, and we are actually more inclined to some of those controversial statements, things which are maybe more polarizing or reinforce our existing views, confirmation bias. So I think that there should be maybe something there if we kind of generally agree that having that polarization on those platforms is bad, then I guess we could put in some hard-coded bit of that algorithm which goes against that. But I don't know what your thoughts are as to what that could be. But
yes, it's a really interesting question, and exactly as Kieren was saying. So remember, the goal is to maximize engagement, and there are many means to achieve that goal. And if we look at human behavior, a lot of the time we are attracted to things that result in a big emotional response. So a lot of that's anger. A lot of this is negative emotion. I think humans have a bias in negative emotion and like anxiety because in the wild, it's better to assume there's a tiger in a bush and there isn't one than assume there isn't one there is. So we can understand that there's some human nature that is leveraging. But the other part of the question is, so that's the human side, but the other side is that a lot of these algorithms are behind closed walls. They're not transparent. So what that means is that a good example of the opposite of this is X or Twitter. They've open sourced their recommendation system. So that means that we can actually know exactly, it's not necessary for the everyday person to be able to understand the code, but at least with it out there, some computer scientists can actually go through the code and see, does this system actually care more about your anger or your happiness? And when you ask about, oh, how can we change the systems, we'd actually have to change the code if they are coded that way. But the first step to unveiling that is for them to be transparent.
Yeah, I guess the difficulty there is that like the responsibility is kind of on the people making the systems. It's kind of limited in our ability to like, you and I can't go and change Facebook's code on Recommender, right? So there's a downside to that. But I think later we're going to touch on like other things that we can do as well.
Yeah, and just one last point before we move on. I think, Twitter did do that and open source their algorithm, and that promoted a lot of discussion around whether we should try and change that algorithm. But that is by no means a status quo. Only last week, there's a big section of Google's search ranking algorithm which was leaked, and there were so many instances in there where it completely contradicted public statements that they'd made on what went into ranking pages. So yeah, we need that public discussion. We need to know what currently they're ranking in order to push back. So
great,
cool.
That will wrap up the first bit of questions, I think. But thank you, everyone.
We do this segment in our podcast to break the flow a little bit. I know we've kind of done that with questions, but it's our fun fact segment. So we often get a bit doomy and gloomy, pessimistic. So we've added this little segment where we just bring a random fun fact about AI. And we've also enlisted Hugh to give one. So do you want to lead us on yours? Yeah,
sure. Usually in the podcast, they play like elevator music in the background whilst they're saying the fun fact. So you're going to have to like imagine that's in the background, but our audio budget didn't stretch for that today.
Hey, Riku here. Lucky for our offline audience, our audio budget does, in fact, stretch this far.
Okay, so my fun fact is about a YouTube video I watched by a YouTuber called Michael Reeves. He does kind of goofy engineering programming videos. So the first video of his I watched was he'd modified a Roomba so that every time it crashed into an object, it would swear. So that's the kind of projects that he does. And he got a sponsorship from an app that does like financial trading and investment, and they were like, make a funny video using our app. So he actually developed his own trading algorithm called Fish with the help of Frederick, his goldfish. So what he did is he each day would randomly pick 2 companies that you could buy stock from. He then had a camera aimed at Frederick's fish tank and was tracking where Frederick was during the day. And then so one company would be like left and one would be right of the fish tank, and then whichever side Frederick spent more time in, that was the stock he bought. And so he got money from the trading app company to kind of test Frederick. Frederick did really well. He actually outperformed the NASDAQ, which is one of the top 3 trading indexes. And the money that the YouTuber made, he like reinvested in making Frederick's fish tank nicer. So.
Very nice. Yeah. I think I need to buy a goldfish as well.
Yeah.
So yeah, my fun fact is actually about sports. So during the COVID-19 pandemic, there was a football team up in Scotland, Inverness FC, and they, when they were trying to limit the number of employees at the football ground, they enlisted this AI ball tracking system for their cameras so that the camera would operate itself and always have the perfect view of the football, which sounds great, but then in reality, when they actually started using it, whenever the football went out of bounds, so for a throw-in or a corner, and then it would go back into play, the camera would actually get locked onto the bald head of one of the lines person, and it would just carry on filming him walking around. So, yeah, I found that quite funny.
I think I've heard that 3 times. I find it funny. I've got a really short and sweet one, just using my half Japanese background. So, AI, if you spell the letters out, I means love in Japanese.
Oh, that's sweet.
A bit more optimistic and positive sentiment.
Right, now back to how Gen AI is going to ruin the world.
Sounds about right, yeah.
Cool.
So second half now, so we're going to resume a little bit more content before the last round of questions, and we're going to be focusing on looking forward at generative AI.
Yeah, so the first half we're kind of looking back because we see social media being integrated a number of years ago now, and we can see the outcomes of that. And we kind of refer to this as humans' first contact with AI because it's the first time where widespread hidden AI usage was integrated in society, and now we can see kind of some of the outcomes of that. And the next contact is with generative AI. We're seeing it massively integrated. I think everyone's heard of ChatGPT now. In fact, we're thinking if there's a show of hands, like who's used ChatGPT before? Just once, or again?
So a lot of people in the room, yeah.
And like maybe who's used it this month? Or this week? Who's it every day? Okay, so there's quite a large number. So this really highlights how transformative it is because it's already around. Everyone's already using it, and it can do so many different things.
Yeah. And it is, it's tricky, right? Like looking in the face of a new technology and trying to know what all those responsibilities will be. I think it's easy what we've just done, like in hindsight, looking back at recommendation systems. Now we know the effects that they've had on society, and it's much trickier to do that looking forward. But I guess the way that we wanted to try and do that today a little bit, I think what's good is to, I know Riku in the last half mentioned expectations versus reality. So I think asking ourselves that question about why is this new technology so transformative, and what promises are we being made by the companies developing them currently, and what could the flip side of those be?
Yeah, and we're seeing a lot of education, the idea of democratizing education. Everyone now has access to Einstein if they want to learn about physics. Surprisingly, a lot of people use it for emotional advice, and just writing text is one you'd expect, code, and it's generally producing things faster. And in line with today's topic of hidden AI, we just need to appreciate that the more we integrate it into our society, and the idea of hidden, where it's not clear whether if you're publishing some content and you use AI and someone's receiving it, that's hidden AI. They didn't know it was being used for that. The more power it has, the more it's integrated. Another thing, just as a prediction for some outcomes, think about for education. If we're all learning from ChatGPT, you can see whatever bias ChatGPT has, whatever worldview, we can see a homogenization of ideas. If we're all learning from the same teacher, can we expect to have completely different worldviews?
Yeah.
So we have to be very conscious about our reliance on this technology.
And then also with that homogenization of ideas, that information is then going back and being used to train new algorithms, and then you just get this sort of convergence. But yeah, reliance is a really important one, and I think when we were first discussing that, it sounds as though it's a problem for in maybe several years' time when these machines are much more capable, and maybe it's not something we need to address now. But we're already seeing, concerningly, generative AI getting integrated into that hidden AI category, whereas previously we'd very much go to chatgpt.com or we go to DALL-E for kind of image generation. We knew what we were signing ourselves up for, so we were going explicitly to get generative AI, maybe aware of the caveats there. But now we're starting to see several examples of where it's running in the background without our explicit awareness. So I think one really good example of that is just last month, Google released their AI overview feature. So for those of you who haven't heard of this, when you would go and Google search something, they added this generative component, which at the top of the search page would give you like a summary of what you were searching for. And they explicitly said that this wasn't the same technology as the large language models powering ChatGPT, and it therefore wouldn't hallucinate as much. But we saw these very weird and funny examples where it very much was hallucinating. So I think there was someone who they were trying to make homemade pizza, and they Googled, what do I do if my pizza toppings keep sliding off? And this summary feature said, oh, you can just try super gluing them back on. So I guarantee that was probably a hallucination. So they've been reeling back in this feature. And another example of kind of reliance that is very clear where the downsides could be is actually somewhat aligned with the research that I do in synthetic biology. So there's been some incredible research in the past few months on generative AI being able to produce, so there was this research that was done, and these models produce a whole new class of antibiotics that were able to fight antibiotic-resistant bacteria. And the researchers and the biologists that were using this tool said that it did that in a way that they would never have thought to do themselves. That's incredible, but as long as we prioritize the performance and more instances where it's generating brand new things, and we don't equally prioritize understanding those systems, how they're making those decisions, we could get in some very sticky situations. So, maybe in several generations' time of that software, it's working so much faster and producing these genetic modifications that are so far beyond any biologist that we kind of just have to take it for granted, and then we move it into the physical real world, and it kills millions of people. So that's kind of one doomsday scenario there. Where
take these drugs, why?
Yeah.
The AI told me to.
Yeah, exactly. So we've got all this stuff now going on in the background, and I guess just to reiterate that point, there was a statistic released from Europol a couple of years ago, and they released this big statement on the current situation with generative AI and looking forward to predicting the future. And they estimated that by 2026, up to 90% of new content going online could be synthetically generated. And that's even, again, that's in 2026, which scarily is just around the corner now. But even earlier this week, there was a BBC article which found that lots of young voters in the UK were receiving and being recommended content on TikTok and Instagram about this upcoming election that was generated by AI, featuring key politicians, misleading content, factually inaccurate content. So it's happening, isn't it, now?
Yeah, I mean, Hugh, you had an example about the...
Yeah, I mean, I had two examples off the top of my head. So yesterday at our data hazard session, one of the events that we saw was in elections in India, people were using deepfakes of actually dead politicians to spread political discourse. But kind of closer to home in my own work, there's been lots of studies done where they're looking at the number of papers that have the phrase "as a large language model" being published, which is, if you've not used ChatGPT before, is like a key thing that it will say, like, as a large language model, I can't tell you how to do this, but here's how to do this. And so someone will be like, hey, could you write my abstract for my paper? And then just blindly copy and paste it in, and you're seeing this massive increase in papers with these mentioning, with people just publishing it because they didn't read it, and then the review is just somehow missing it. So that's not great.
So yeah, where's this going? And I think we've heard on the internet a lot of people talking about the existential risk of AI, and that's more of a long-term view. And we're actually not going to talk about that because there's a much shorter-term vision that we can all imagine, which is trust collapse. So now that the recommendation systems curate, they show you what you're going to see. Generative AI creates what you will see. So those two things together is the complete picture now. And given that we have 90% of online content is likely to become AI generated, there's this problem of trust collapse. And a good analogy is to look at money. Like the world relies on the trust that the money we use is real. And there's so many regulations to stop counterfeited money. And because of that, we can actually use the utility of it. And the same can be said about the digital world, that we see so many benefits of it. But this technology is going to undermine our trust, and we'll lose all the benefits.
You almost start getting like counterfeit information, almost, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. So I guess given all that, it's very doomsday scenario-y, but what can we do in this situation?
Yeah, so what can we do? So there's kind of three classic bins to separate this. So there's government action, industrial action, and what the individuals can do. And to begin with, on the government side, there's a really good example of what the EU did with data protection, so the GDPR laws. Every time you click on a website, you can read what the website's data is collecting from you, and you can consent to that before you use the website. And that's kind of the idea of transparency, and we can see that it would be great to have that similar thing enforced by governments, where if you go on a website, you can see exactly where AI is being used and your consent and being aware, so it's no longer hidden.
Yeah. And obviously we've got this algorithmic transparency policy being kind of written up and employees, but as I'm sure we're all aware, we can't always wait for government, so there is definitely onus on the industry. And I guess one reason why we need to think about that is because we find ourselves currently in a very similar situation to the situation that brought us the recommendation systems, as we were discussing earlier. So we've got a very select set of these big companies in a very small geographical location in the world that are developing them, and we're now, again, as we were recommendation systems, in this arms race to produce the most capable AI that's got the latest features. And the reason that's very concerning is there's many reasons, but one of them is down to this idea of emergent abilities. So these are capabilities of these models which weren't there in previous versions, but just as they scale up and throw more money at these algorithms, they're able to do new and wonderful things. And the very scary part about that is that most of the emergent abilities have been identified by members of the public and research groups after they've been released out into the wild. So we need some incentive for these companies to slow themselves down and have a much more robust testing system, whether it's kind of a regulatory body that sets guidelines for how they need to test these algorithms before they're released into the wild.
Yeah, and on what individuals can do, I want to start off with some encouraging words, because I think there's a preconception about AI that it's not very understandable, and as researchers we've looked at the maths and completely agree. But if we can flip this on its head and actually realize that the maths reflects the concepts that are building these AI systems. So if we look just today, yes, we haven't explained any of the maths of recommendation systems, but the concept is that they maximize clicks, and we can make some predictions about how that would affect society. And I think that is the kind of level that we encourage people to try and learn. It's definitely learnable. We can definitely learn the concepts underpinning this technology.
Yeah, definitely. And this is a perfect point for me to plug our podcast, but that is our central goal there with the podcast, and why we've kind of come here today to give you a taste of that. But we very much believe that this information is digestible, but no one seemed, at least in podcast format, to try and take all these different technologies and areas that AI has been integrated and demystify them. So yeah, we would love if you could kind of check out the podcast, because this is our central goal, is to educate people in this very non-technical way. And we think everyone needs to hear this. You know, it's AI is going to affect everyone, our friends, our families. So yeah, we would love if you could share the word.
Cool. So I think we have time for a few more questions. So yes, Mike, would you mind bringing a microphone to the gentleman on the front row, please? Thank you.
I just want to bring a scenario. I saw an article recently, and I saw the screen grab of it, and I posted it. I can share it with you afterwards. It's about AI at Meta. So I think it's already in the US, but I think it's coming to UK soon. But there was an example where parent groups, so often on Facebook, people get together to chat to other people, and they're expecting to get recommendations from other people, but they received unrequested AI at Meta giving recommendations about a specific school for specific children. It was about children, autistic children, and recommended specific schools and said, I have a child, and my child had a good experience there. So I think part of my concerns, and just a question about that, is how much have we fed it, and how much is it going to keep feeding? And with Gemini and Gmail, now, what does the GDPR mean in terms of what we've already shared and what historically it's had access to?
Yeah, very interesting question. So you're saying this kind of content being recommended is generated as well, so it's this kind of...
Well, I mean, I didn't go in to look more as to whether that was an actual school and whether it was true, but my assumption is that that content probably is quite meaningful, because it's probably someone else's story, and it's aggregated some kind of stories, and maybe it's anonymized it, but it's definitely wrong to say, I have a child, when it's not even conscious that it's saying it.
Yeah, I think this falls into this category of misuse. So, you know, it's a capability of these algorithms, and there's a couple of concerning things. I guess one is that, you know, maybe the companies developing these tools do put like guardrails in place to stop you from generating certain types of content that can be very controversial or actually reference that data in the training. So any copyrighted stuff or protected information. But there's not enough time being spent, I think, on those guardrails, because there's not been a single instance of any generative tool, whether that's a chatbot, that hasn't been kind of jailbroken, where people were able to very easily get rid of those guardrails and get it to say things that it wasn't meant to. So we definitely need to focus more on, or incentivize the companies to focus more on guardrailing it, making them robust to not replicating any copyrighted information. But there's also something else which is really interesting. I don't know if you might want to touch on this, but we need to know instances when something has been generated or that is kind of a real human. So that's a very difficult task, but there is something really interesting going on with this radioactive data, isn't there? That is a possible way to trace the source of that information. I don't know if you touch on that.
I mean, I think it's deviates slightly from the question, but one way to safeguard against fake generated content was, if you imagine like a watermark. Like I remember when I was at school trying to make a presentation, and I'd copy and paste an image from Google, and it'll be like stock images, and everyone knows I stole the image. So the whole point of that is our human eyes can see that, oh, this person stole the image. You can do the opposite with AI, so you can actually have a hidden watermark that our eyes don't see, so it doesn't affect the quality for us, but an AI can easily detect whether this image is genuine or not. But it's very interesting about this idea about the AI authority. So how much faith do we have in the outputs? Because this is about truth. Like, did this AI accurately reflect this school recommendation? And one kind of tip to consider would be, the more general the concept, the more likely it is to be in training data. But the more specific it is, if it's about a specific school, is it really going to be in training data? Because the problem is that these models are really good at telling stories. Like, you can get Shakespeare to tell you about F1. F1 wasn't the thing in Shakespeare's time, so it's really hard to navigate. That is the annoying answer.
Don't know if that helped, but it was a good question, if nothing else. Yeah. There's a chap in a green shirt with a brown hair over there at the back.
You said at the start that a lot of models are optimizing click-through rate instead of satisfaction. How do you think you change that? Because click-through rate's way easier to measure. satisfaction's really sort of loose and hard to track?
It's a really good question. Yeah.
Very, very interesting question. I think, click-through rate is obviously one piece of the puzzle, but they do have all these different data points on engagement. Time spent on an image, what parts you're focusing on. I think one thing that they're probably not going to do, but if we were to kind of design an algorithm ourselves, I think there definitely should be some incentive to actually recommend you stuff that they have the data for that was positive sentiment towards that. So we actually do know if you've thumbs something up, thumbs it down, if you've heart reacted. So it would be great if we could see, rather than just any engagement, we have the data to know whether it was positive engagement, but that's definitely not being prioritized. It's probably the algorithm, whether it's learned it or whether it's been tuned that way, that it actually, favors things with a negative sentiment.
One thing I'd say, based on the stats you gave earlier about how people using recommender systems on like social media are more likely to spend more time on social media, and I guess it links back to the question that we had previously about whether or not you enjoy the process. But I think if there's a recommended system where you don't enjoy the process, there might be some incentive to actually optimize it to be as quick as possible and to get you off the platform as quickly as possible. Now, I don't own Facebook, so that's not going to work, but just an idea. What do you think, Riku?
I think I'm going to tie a bit of cheeky bit of philosophy here. I think it's a really good question. What is satisfaction, and can we have an equation that maximizes that? And it seems like that's just too hard. So engagement is a proxy for that. We think we click on things we want. We think the things we want are good for us. But as we can see from the outcomes of recommendation systems, a lot of time we click on things that aren't good for us. So again, it's maybe about human values in this case.
Awesome. Thanks for that question. So we do need to wrap up soon. There was one question that we had from the ticket tailor that I wanted to ask. Where can I learn more about this? Which is quite broad, I know, but
Can I plug the podcast again?
Yeah, go on. I don't know if you guys have heard there's this podcast.
You've heard it enough now. Yeah. Books?
Yeah. Have you guys heard of reading? On the panel this morning, someone mentioned my favorite book of all time, Weapons of Math Destruction by Cathy O'Neill. It was the first book I read on the topic of data ethics in general. And I'd also really recommend Automating Inequality by Virginia Eubanks. Both are at least 5 years old, but they're really interesting books that kind of get you into the subject in a non-technical way.
Yeah, I definitely was reading a lot of books on all these topics before we started this podcast, and it's what nudged me to actually come start it with Riku. But I think one that covers the full landscape in a very kind of general way, not too technical, which is one I always recommend to friends and family, is called Scary Smart, which is by an author called Mo Gawdat. He used to be head of machine learning research at Google X. And he's stepped away from there and he was kind of worried in the direction things were heading, and he's now much more kind of human-centric. He also has a great podcast, not to steal our listeners, but he's got a great podcast called Slow Mo, which is kind of doing what we're trying to do, which is kind of give the power back to the people a bit.
But worse.
But worse, sorry, yeah. We do it much better.
I think I've got two books. So one book is called The Shortcut by my previous supervisor, who he's done loads of talks at EU, called Nello Cristianini. And the cool thing about this book is it talks about how a bit of history of AI and touches on some technical points, but it's for the general audience. And specifically, it's about this shortcut where previously AI was kind of built from the bottom up. We were asking ourselves what intelligence is, but then we kind of had this big switch in the AI field where we just copy intelligence, and that's kind of the new paradigm. And it's talking about that shortcut. But another book's called The Alignment Problem, which also covers a bit of an intuition on each type of AI concept and how it relates to society.
That's great. Well, if anyone has any other questions, they can come and find us after the podcast.
Yeah, please come and grab us, yeah.
Thanks both for coming on and do the podcast, and thank you very much for listening, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Hey, so hope you enjoyed that live episode. I know Kieren and I really enjoyed doing it and look forward to doing more of those in the future.
Yeah, definitely. And stay tuned for our next episode, where originally we were going to be looking at is AI getting smarter faster than we thought. However, because today's episode was quite conceptual and we looked a bit at the future of AI, we're actually going to swap that out now. And our next episode is going to be on AI used in warfare and military. So yeah, stay tuned for that. But for now, thank you for listening and catch you next time.